My name is Todd Wilkinson. I'm Ash Grove resident and a military historian. Tonight we're going to talk about Greene County and the Spanish-American War. It's an interesting war. A politician in 1898 called it the Splendid Little War. It's a war that a lot of Americans really don't know a lot about today. If we do know it, we know it as the war where Teddy Rosevelt charged up San Juan Hill. Ironically, he didn't charge up San Juan Hill, he charged up Kettle Hill, which is right next to San Juan Hill. But it's the war that made Teddy Roosevelt president. It's the war that created our modern-day foreign policy. And yet, it's a war where a majority of Americans who joined the Army, Navy, or Marines hardly saw combat. It's a war that has one foot in the 19th century and one foot in the 20th century. It has a lot of remnants from the old Civil War, but it's a modern conflict. It sees modern weaponry. It sees telegraphs. This was the first time that the telephone was used, and we have a war room in the White House where President McKinley can find out what's going on in Cuba. We have newspaper reporters going along with the armies. The newspapers really started the war in many ways. It's a war where Americans are inflamed by things happening overseas in a country that really shouldn't concern them in some ways. But Cuba has been a colony of Spain since at least the 1500s, if not before. And it's the last Spanish colony in the Western Hemisphere, and Puerto Rico too. And it all comes to a head in February of 1898 when the USS Maine, an armored battle cruiser, which is deployed to Havana Harbor to show the flag, blows up mysteriously. And almost immediately the press starts calling for blood. Now most historians believe that the Maine blew up because of a coal bunker explosion. The coal dust spontaneously combusted on the Maine. But over 200 sailors and Marines are killed, and Americans want vengeance. The negotiations continually fail. Spain really isn't taking America's threats seriously. And more people feel that it's time for Americans to enter the conflict on the side of Cuba. Cuba Libre, free Cuba, including one of McKinley's own officials, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt wants to prove himself as an American, as a man. He believes in spiritual and physical manhood. That's his credo. His father didn't serve in the Civil War. His father was able to pay a substitute. Basically in the Civil War, there was a draft, and the federal government actually established a policy. This had actually been around since the days of the Revolution, where if you could produce enough money, like $300, you could actually pay for somebody to go for you. And so Roosevelt's always felt guilty about that, and he feels like he needs to uphold the honor of the Roosevelt name. Community patriotism is what drives a lot of this. You go join the Army in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, because your community expects you to. And if you don't, people are paying attention. So, war is declared in April of 1898. There's a great photo in the Ash Grove City Hall, just inside the front doors, and it shows a rally that's held at Union Park down on the west end of Main Street. The photo's dated July of 1898, but the trees in the photo really lend to the fact that it's probably spring. And the photo shows a rally being held in Union Park, the flagpole, the American flag there flying high. Citizens are gathering right by the railroad tracks. There's a band. And there's a great description on the back of the photo of the rally and how a Reverend Kaufman, a local minister here in Ash Grove, made a speech. And he pulled out a comb out of his pocket, and the comb was all broken and no tines or teeth. And he said that this comb had more chance to comb hair than the Spaniards defeating the United States. About 50 miles down the road in Avila, Missouri, there's a rally that's held in the Methodist Church, and they bring in a bald eagle, and they set the bald eagle on the pulpit, and the minister is literally pulling the tail feathers out of the bald eagle, and every time the bald eagle screamed, they said it was the American eagle screaming against the dons of Spain. There were Cuban flags flying everywhere. There's a Cuban flag flying from the Webster County Courthouse in Marshfield. Just like we see Ukrainian flags today, as Americans show their support for the Ukrainians who are under occupation, Americans feel that sympathy with Cuba. So Greene County produces 2 companies to fight in the Spanish-American War. The 2nd Missouri Infantry Regiment was the National Guard unit here in southwest Missouri. And normally in a regiment there are 10 companies. 2nd Missouri has 12 companies. Companies are generally organized in a county or a town. Joplin has a company. Carthage has a company. Nevada has a company. Springfield has a company. These National Guard companies are almost social organizations as well as military organizations. And Carthage has a band, and the Joplin company puts on amateur theater, and there are dinners and balls and fancy uniforms, and it's a social standing as well, but there's also drill, there's also training, and a lot of the old Civil War veterans saw what happened when you had untrained soldiers sent into combat. Again, they're wearing uniforms that really aren't designed for tropical warfare. The rifle that they're carrying is essentially a Civil War musket that's been modified to load from the back, the breech, but it still fires black powder, white smoke. That doesn't really disguise your position in combat. It's using an old Civil War style triangular bayonet. The federal government doesn't have the money or the equipment to outfit all of these state volunteers coming from Missouri or Arkansas or Arizona territory with the latest equipment and weapons. And so the regulars, they go off to war with a bolt-action rifle. It's actually a Norwegian rifle called the Krag Jorgensen, 30-40 caliber. It has a magazine on the side of it. Great rifle, not as good as what the Spanish have. The Mauser, the Spanish Mauser, the Spanish Hornet they call it. And a lot of Europeans are predicting that the Americans are going to lose this fight. They think that the Spanish are going to win, and the Spanish fleet sails, and America doesn't know that Spanish battleships aren't going to show up in New York Harbor and start shelling the place. But Roosevelt, he's smart. He's already deployed the American Navy. They destroy the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in May of 1898. It's a huge PR victory for the Americans. Admiral Dewey becomes a household name, and it's Theodore Roosevelt that sends the American Pacific Fleet to Manila in the Philippine Islands, who gets a lot of the credit for that victory. And of course, that means that America is now ready to essentially take over the Philippines from the Spanish. While that's going on, we're gathering our forces. The Greene County boys, we know that by May of 1898, boys from Ash Grove, Walnut Grove, Springfield, Fairgrove, they are being shipped on the railroad up to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And that's where the 2nd Missouri Infantry and all of the Missouri National Guard units are going to gather and eventually be shipped to another location. So they ride the cars, they ride the rail up to St. Louis. In late May, they're sent to Camp Thomas, which is on the old battlefield at Chickamauga, Georgia. Is literally a village that's grown overnight. It's got a blacksmith shop, it's got stores, it's got saloons, and it's got everything that a soldier could want and maybe shouldn't have. And discipline is going to be a major issue. It also has disease. And again, it's interesting that more soldiers die of disease in the Spanish-American War than combat deaths. It's a staggering number because we still really don't understand how cholera and typhoid and other diseases spread. We send people off to tropical climates with no concept of vaccination, immunization. So you've got Americans going off to Cuba and catching yellow fever and malaria. But you don't have to go to Cuba. You can literally catch it in Georgia. And in the summer of 1898, all of these communicable diseases spread like wildfire through these training camps. It's pretty boring existence. There's a really great account from a Springfield resident of service at Camp Thomas, and he talks a lot about how they entertained themselves. They were constantly drilling, but a lot of times it was downtime. They were bored. They were missing home. They'd signed up to fight. They weren't being sent overseas. So humor was a good way to get through that. There's a couple of great stories. There's a story of a Georgia woodcutter who was contracted by the government to supply wood to the soldiers. And he reportedly made a statement that he loved selling wood to Missourians because Missourians knew a cord of wood, unlike the dang New Yorkers. The Civil War also played a role in that. There's a great story where a Webster County resident was passing himself off as the illegitimate son of Jesse James in the camp. And he would stand under a tree, and some of his squad mates would literally sell pictures of Jesse James's illegitimate son to soldiers from other states like New York and Ohio. And the fellow that was writing this account said, I wonder how many pictures of this fellow are on the walls of homes in New York to this day, thinking that that was Jesse James, and in reality it was Private Yandel of Marshfield, Missouri, who was having some fun with that. So these fellows spent the summer reading the accounts of the battles in Cuba. We land in late June of 1898. It almost was a disaster in the making. This is not D-Day. There's no landing craft. You're throwing horses out of ships and hoping that they'll swim to shore. The soldiers are coming ashore at Daiquiri and making their way overland to Santiago, Cuba. And in the meantime, we still totally don't know where the Spanish fleet is. The Spanish fleet eventually ends up in Santiago, and the Americans bottle it up in the harbor fairly quickly with a force of their own. Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, Buffalo soldiers, African-American soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, as well as other regular and volunteer regiments, make their way to Santiago, and they go up against the Spanish on the San Juan Heights. And on July 1st, 1898, this is where Roosevelt makes his charge up Kettle Hill and then crosses over a valley to assist the Buffalo soldiers on San Juan Hill. And this is where Roosevelt's star rises. This is where Roosevelt becomes a household name. Colonel Roosevelt leading the Rough Riders, Arizona Cowboys, and Harvard yachtsmen and polo players forming that regiment. That's, again, the best of America, the best of both worlds. You can imagine these Missourians' disappointment. You're sitting in Georgia in the middle of summer and you're reading the newspaper accounts and wondering why you weren't sent, why you weren't trusted to go to Cuba. They end up spending the whole summer there. They make one move to Albany, Georgia, and they're discharged in 1899. They never leave the United States. There are casualties, as I mentioned. Again, more of those Americans die from disease in the training camps. We know that, for example, Sergeant Charles Wood of Carthage, Missouri, who was a journalist, he would write regular columns home in the Carthage Free Press, the newspaper, talking about their experiences, dies of cholera. His body is brought back by rail to Jasper County, and he actually lies in state in the Jasper County courthouse. He's one of the few people ever given that honor. And it's a great ceremony. The Civil War veterans turn out, the flags are flying, his comrades are there. He's not killed in combat. He's not killed fighting the Spanish. He dies from cholera. But it's a sacrifice. It's proving your manhood. The ultimate irony, of course, is that in 1912, on a whistle-stop tour, there in Union Park, Theodore Roosevelt, Bull Moose presidential candidate, third-party candidate, 1912, the election of 1912, shows up in Ash Grove. He's making a whistle-stop tour. He starts off in the morning on September 23rd in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He makes his way across to Lamar and then eventually ends up in Ash Grove. He makes a 5-minute water stop. There are remarks made from the back of the rail car, and then the train proceeds on into Springfield, where he gives a speech at Drury College. It's interesting to bookend that story, the Spanish-American War, that rally that's held in the spring in Union Park as the residents of Ash Grove remember the Maine. And then in 1912, probably a lot of those veterans who served from Greene County are there in attendance to watch Colonel Roosevelt run for president one last time. A splendid little war, a war that doesn't get a lot of attention, but a conflict that was very much in the forefront of residents of Ash Grove in 1898. And for those residents of Greene County, those residents of Ash Grove that volunteered and served their country, even though they didn't go overseas, it was one that made an impact with them for the rest of their days.